Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. Today, we are going to talk about Octax lasers and trophectoderm biopsy. My name is Victoria Sanchez from VitroLife, and today we will learn about all the basics from Octax laser systems, and then I will tell you a little bit about different techniques to do the trophectoderm biopsy. I hope you enjoy this webinar. So the first half of this presentation is dedicated to going through all the basics, ranging from the history of Octax lasers, how it works, why it works, and then we will talk about more practical considerations when you're doing a trophectoderm biopsy. I will tell you a little bit about applications in general, but we will focus more towards the end of this talk on the techniques such as pulling and flicking for the biopsy. Before we dive in and get started, I would like to remind you of the IVF journey and for you to keep in mind the bigger picture and how we at VitroLife are dedicating all of our work to provide you with the best possible products to address each and every single step of the IVF journey. So we have everything ranging from oocyte retrieval all the way to cryopreservation, and having that bigger picture in mind, for you also to know where this particular topic that we're discussing today is fitting in, namely evaluation. So whenever it comes to that specific part of evaluation, that's where our product family of Octax lasers fits in. When we talk about Octax laser systems, we're talking about a system that is highly known worldwide by its efficiency, safety, and reliability. And in the next few slides, we will learn more about why this is a safe system, robust, that also is sufficient in terms of workflow. So let's get started by talking about fundamentals. First, I want you to have a look at this slide where we are mentioning some examples of the beginnings of what we know today. I think it's always very good and important to know the history behind things as we know them today, and this is the purpose of this slide. So here we are having a look at the spectrum of light and how during the late 80s, beginning of the 90s, different studies were being carried out for testing different wavelengths of light. And here are some examples. From these lists that we see here, I want to highlight that publication from 1994 by Dr. Ring, who was the founder of Octax lasers, were based on the results. They have proposed the 1.48 micrometer infrared laser to be the most optimal one for laser use in IVF. Since then, that became the absolute gold standard worldwide for the use of laser systems in assisted reproduction. In the next slide, we're going to see why this was chosen. So the reason chosen the 1.48 micrometer wavelength to be used for IVF applications had to do with the absorption coefficient. So in this graph, we are seeing the wavelength of light versus absorption coefficient in water. And this is, again, the 1.48 micrometer wavelength had the best absorption coefficient of water in a way that could be safe and controlled for applying in biological systems. Remember, absorption coefficient in water is very important for us in this context, because we're working with water-based solutions, which are our culture media, and also cells and then biological structures in general We are also ourselves made mainly of water. So based on that, again, we have decided, or it was proposed, to work with this wavelength, and that became the gold standard. Okay, in the next slide, I want to talk about laser function. So why is it working? How does it actually work? Well, basically, we have a beam of light, which is the laser, a very focused beam of light, photons having the same wavelength that are being directed onto a sample, in this case, via the objective. This laser beam is being directed onto the microscope stage, onto the sample. And then what you see here on the image on the left side, indicated by a red dot, would be the target position. So the focus point where the maximum effect and energy and temperature peak is directed. And then this heat, of course, will be spread out. And the way it is spread out, which I think it's very important for you to understand in order to also understand why it is safe, is that the heat is spread axially and not radially. So if we have the laser coming from the bottom, as indicated by the arrow here, coming from the bottom, and it is going upwards, and the heat will continue to spread out in that direction and not towards the periphery or radially towards the surrounding of the local position. That means that the surroundings will remain safe, and that the heat that is being applied will be focused on that position. Now, if we move to the right side of the slide and have a look here on this zona pellucida, of course, looking at it from above two-dimensionally, it appears as if we have completely taken out a piece of the zona pellucida. But when you remember the three-dimensional structure of this, and then rotate the embryo a bit and move the focus, then you realize that we have actually created a slit on the zona pellucida. So again, here to summarize this slide and to briefly recap from the previous slide, in this we are using a laser beam that is going through layers of traveling through layers of material and ultimately becoming a heat, and that heat is what is creating the effect as we see it visually, the effect of opening a hole on the zona in the case of assisted hatching, or the effect of cutting through junctions in the case of trophectoderm biopsy. In this next slide, we see that the energy that is effective on the zona pellucida is a result of two factors. Number one is the laser power, which in our case is a fixed and low laser power. Low laser power is important to emphasize because, of course, this means lower peak temperatures and safer temperatures, but let's say more safety for our embryos. And the second factor that is the second factor that is determining the effect of the laser is the exposure time, which means the laser pulse length. We are able to modify this. This is the only one variable from these factors that can be modified by us as the user, and that is the time of exposure. And when you're working on the system, on the eyewear system, which I will talk about more later on in this presentation, you realize that you have the option to increase or decrease the time. Now remember, again, as I said, this laser is turning into heat, and this heat is what is being effective on the target position. This means that obviously then if I increase the time, this translates into a bigger aperture or a bigger effect. And conversely, the other way around as well, if I decrease the time, then the effect will be less and the aperture will be smaller. And this is what's being illustrated here on the image on the left side. So you see different sizes of the holes, meaning that if I increase the time, it would be bigger. If I decrease the time, it would be smaller. I've already mentioned this before, but again, the Octax laser system is a low laser power, which is improving safety and resulting in lower peak temperatures, again, safer for the embryos. And this has been shown in a multitude of preclinical, clinical studies, several publications that we have available. And in fact, if you want to have a closer look at the literature that we have related with the use of Octax lasers, please feel free to ask us, because we do have a literature list that we can provide you with the references in order for you to have a closer look at that. In this next slide, we're looking at two examples of also some of these publications that I was telling you about before. From here, I think it's a very practical image, or this is a very good electron microscopy image for you to have an idea in your mind of how the laser is actually causing an effect on the zona pellucida. Remember, I was telling you that we are opening a slit because the laser is coming from the bottom and moving upwards. And in this publication, it was seen that there were no alterations of the cytoplasm due to the thermal effect. In the next slide, without going into too much detail, this is just a list again of some examples of those publications in the early days of Octax lasers. But here, the bottom line is simply that we have had no evidence that the laser technology has had any negative effect. So this last couple of slides are supporting or to explain how the system is safe for the embryos. Now, from the perspective of the user, I also want to comment at this point that there is also no need to worry about, and I say that because I hear often when I'm presenting or demonstrating or talking with people that there's still sometimes a little bit of fear around the fact of laser use for the user himself. And I want you to know that there is no contact whatsoever with the laser beam and the eyepieces, so the optical path, meaning that when you're sitting on the microscope and you are looking through the oculars and see a red dot, this is not the actual laser beam, but an LED light indicating the position of the laser beam. And there is no contact whatsoever between the actual laser beam and your eyes. And so also a safety for you as the user. Okay, so next, we're going to have a closer look at, let's say, three layers of what Octax lasers are. So more than just a laser, we will see a closer look at the different components, hardware components, and some optional add-ons that are available. Then we're going to talk about the software and the database. So simply think of this system as a system that is giving you a lot of functionality beyond the use of the laser, and that you can also manage a database easily via the software. So let's have a closer look. There are two systems available. The first one is called LaserShot. This was developed first, and the second one is called Octax Navilace. The difference between them being simply that LaserShot is a static or fixed laser, which means that you have to move the embryo towards the target position because the target position of the laser is always fixed. And in the case of Octax Navilase, we're talking about a dynamic, flexible laser system. This is the more modern version that has been developed more recently, and it's recommended for all dynamic procedures. So whenever you're doing applications where you need multiple laser pulses, of course, Navilase would be the way to go. If you want to optimize your workflow, of course, and work more efficiently. What is the laser used for? So here we have a slide showing us the applications for lasers in general. First of all, of course, assisted hatching, which we can do by the so-called sonar drilling or by sonar thinning. And of course, we have embryo biopsy. Earlier, let's say in the earlier days, mostly done by blastomeral biopsies. Nowadays, commonly done by trophectoderm biopsy. We would rather do a trophectoderm biopsy, of course. And then embryo collapsing, because we have seen better survival rates when the embryo has been collapsed prior to vitrification. And that is simply because then it can better absorb the cryoprotectants and then better survive after the warming. And a less known, probably less common application would be sperm viability testing, which is particularly useful in cases of severe male factor or testicular sperm, whenever you need to identify between a modal sperm, which one is viable and which one not, and simply apply a laser pulse at the tip of the flagellum and wait to see if there is a reaction. And if there is a membrane reaction, that you know that that sperm is viable. For the embryo collapsing, also it's what's needed is to apply one laser pulse between two cells towards the zona pellucida, and that will result in the collapsing of the embryo. Embryo biopsy, I will describe into much more detail later on in the second half of this talk. And assisted hatching, as I said, usually if you were doing a sonar drilling, then one or two pulses are typically enough to do the opening. So what are the components? Here we see we have an overview of all the hardware components which are installed on the microscope. Usually the most microscopes will be compatible with our lasers. In case of doubt, you can always check with your contact person, with your representative in your local representative. Simply ask them and let them know what model of microscope you have so that we can check. But in general, our laser systems are compatible with most commonly used microscope models and brands. So what do we have? We have the laser module, which is installed in the back of the microscope. We always need, of course, a fluorescence port available on the microscope for that. Then we have the laser lens. It's a 25 objective. We have our camera. This one's typically installed on the left side of the microscope. We have our foot switch having a double, it's a double pedal foot switch on the right side. We can activate the laser, and by pressing the left side, we can take screenshots as we go. In the next, component that we have here is the motion controller. This is specific for the case of Navilase, because Navilase is the dynamic version. This piece is the one responsible for controlling the movements of the mirrors in order to direct the laser beam to the desired position. And then, of course, our dichroic mirror block. Those were the components that are always part of the system. And then on top of that, there are some optional pieces of hardware. For example, there's the target pointer and the adaptive electronic condenser. the target pointer has been developed specifically for embryo biopsy. And this can be particularly helpful if you want to, for example, do the biopsies by pulling while keeping your eyes on the microscope, on the eyepieces. That way you can see indicated in the center of the visual field, in the center of the, yes, of the microscope field, you will see a red dot marking the home position. And in that way you can keep your eyes on the microscope, both hands on the micromanipulators, your foot on the pedal, ready to press it whenever you're ready to apply the laser pulse, and your eyes will know exactly where this is being directed to, thanks to the target pointer. The adaptive electronic condenser would replace the condenser of the microscope. It is giving you an optimized image quality. We have then also there an electronic display that is helping us to have a better workflow. For example, if you're changing between objectives and you have this condenser combined with the sync box, then the contrast phase will automatically be adapted. For the purpose of biopsy, I find it particularly helpful so that you can very easily focus well on the edge of the cell. You can move by the touch of your finger on the display and simply change the angle to create a different pattern of shadows or different contrast in order to better visualize whatever you're trying to focus. And it is also quite practical if you're using other Octax, other products from the Octax family, like for example, Polarade, because it already has integrated hardware components in it. Good, so far we've talked about the hardware. What about the software? So the software we are using is called eyewear, and eyewear on its own has a lot of functionality and a lot of features that are very practical that go beyond the use of the laser. So eyewear has, I would say, three different purposes, or yes, it's a multi-purpose software. First of all, it's an imaging tool, so on its own, combined with the camera, of course, it can be used as a standalone system only for imaging purposes. Then second, it is used for operating the laser system. So anything that has to be done with the laser can only be done via the software. So this is needed for operating the laser. And then third is it is also an archival software. So we are also using it for managing our database. We can create pictures and videos from embryos and be able to browse between the data and the files and export them as needed. So why do we always hear why people who are working with laser shot or Navilace love it? The reasons they love it are, well, one very common reason is the fact that the system is calibration free. So once our engineers are on site and do the installation, there is a calibration that takes place at time of installation, and that is all, unless there is a major change like moving the microscope or for some reason misaligning some of the parts, there is no need for you to calibrate before use. So one calibration done, and that is all. Then the fact that it is hands-free, and we say hands-free because remember I was telling you that you're working, activating the laser with your feet, with using the foot switch. So both hands will be free for the micromanipulators. And eyes-free if you're working with the target pointer. So if you have the option of knowing where the laser is being targeted by the use of the target pointer, then you can keep your eyes on the microscope or you can at least have the option to choose whether you look into the monitor or keep your eyes on the oculars. Okay, so we have at this point reached half of our presentation. Having covered all the basics, I would like to now go a little bit deeper into the specific application of trophectoderm biopsy. And we're going to have a look at the step-by-step procedure for the biopsy by pulling and then for the biopsy by the so-called flicking technique. And I will show you at the end one video example for each case. So we saw in a previous slide the different applications of assisted hatching, embryo biopsy, sperm viability testing, and collapsing. And now we're going to specifically talk about trophectoderm biopsy. As you may know, when we need to do a biopsy for implantation genetic analysis, preferably we will do this on day 5 so that we have our blastocyst that has already differentiated and so that we can take a representative sample from the embryo by cutting some cells from the trophectoderm. That way the inner cell mass that will become the baby can remain intact. And then these cells that are biopsied will be sent for analysis. Okay, before we look at the step-by-step procedure, I want to mention 3 basic principles that may sound a bit silly, perhaps even, or too basic, but these are, very basic things to keep in mind and to make sure that are working fine before you even start a laser. First of all, always start at the bottom of the dish. So when you're working with a laser, always make sure that you're working at the bottom of the dish, because remember, I was telling you before that the laser is traveling through layers, and so obviously the longer the distance it has to travel, the more energy will be absorbed on the way, and the less effective it would appear to be. So if we have a look at the left side, we see we are at the bottom of the dish, and in that case, if I apply the laser, it would work perfectly and do the opening. However, if for some reason by mistake we don't realize that we have lost the focal plane and now we are moving up and are too far away from the bottom, then we will activate the laser and it will appear to be ineffective when in reality it is a matter of focus. Second basic principle, temperature. Of course, if we're saying before that the laser is turning into heat as it is absorbed by the layers that it has to go through, and ultimately it is the heat that is being effective on site, then it seems obvious to think that the temperature is a determining factor. This means that you have to make sure that you have a very stable temperature on the stage and that this temperature is constant and well controlled. For example, if we are using the same exposure time, as it says here as an example of 1.8 milliseconds, and we are having a stable temperature of 37 degrees, then maybe this is the perfect hole to match the thickness of the zona pellucida. But if there is the temperature on the microscope stage is not stable and we have a decrease, then when we apply the same exposure time, it will appear to be less effective or will result in a smaller aperture. And the other way around, if there is an increase of the temperature, then the aperture will be bigger. So basically, if there are variations in the temperature in the surroundings on the stage, this will have an effect on the laser effect. So it will affect the action of the laser on the target position. Bottom line, make sure that the temperature is well controlled. And then finally, as another basic principle, when you're doing the opening, the assisted hatching, even though we saw that the laser system is safe, that it is very focused and the surroundings will not be affected by the thermal action on a specific target position. Regardless of that, it is still in general good practice to choose a position where you have the most perivitellin space. So for example, if I were to do an assisted hatching on this embryo, instead of opening the zona here, I would rather choose a position like this, where you have the most perivitellin space. So this is general good practice. Okay, so having said that, let's have a look at each step for doing the biopsy. We are going through the steps now for the so-called pulling technique. So first of all, we're going to do the opening of the zona pellucida in advance. And this is variable. You can do this on day 3. Again, like in the image before, choosing the zona where you have the most zona perivitellin space, or you can wait until it has already differentiated and you can see the inner cell mass and the trophectoderm. But then, of course, because it will collapse a little bit, you have to give it time to re-expand. So the reason why we don't do the opening right before the biopsy is because the blastocyst will collapse. And we always want to start a biopsy with a hatching embryo. So by opening the zona pellucida in advance, we're making sure that on 2 days later, on day 5, by the time we do the biopsy, we have a hatching embryo. If you do the opening when you can already identify the inner cell mass, then you can be more strategic of the positioning, because then you can do it opposite to it or far away from it. So once you have opened the zona, we start to observe the embryo and see if it's herniating. And if it is, then we can start. We can start by micromanipulating. For example, here would be an ideal case where you have the inner cell mass right opposite to the herniating portion of the trophectoderm. And so we would position the embryo so that the herniating part is located at 3 o'clock, where we will have our biopsy pipette. Once we have positioned it, we start to aspirate. If we're doing a pulling, we want to hold the embryo by the zona pellucida with the holding pipette very tight, so we apply more aspiration than usual. We want to grab into the pipette a little bit of the zona. And then we will start to come closer with the biopsy pipette, which, by the way, should have a small inner diameter of, let's say, 25 microns, maybe 30, but the smaller the better, because then you can have a better, you can better grasp or yes, take in the cells into it when you are aspirating. You create aspiration and you need to apply a lot of tension so that you can start to expose the junctions, okay? We're going to use the laser once we have exposed the junctions between the cells, and for that we need to apply a lot of tension. So we pull and stretch, and then when you can see those junctions, that's when you're going to cut using the laser. With the Navilase, which has a working mode that has been specially designed for trophectoderm, for cutting junctions between trophectoderm cells, you also have in the eyewear software the possibility to choose between 1, 2, or 3 pulses for each time you press the laser. This is up to you how to configure it, and it's meant to be able to help you to make sure that for each shot you can cut 1 junction. And in general, 2 to 3 laser pulses will do the job. Sometimes the junctions can be very strong, and perhaps you will need an additional pulse. If that's the case, simply continue stretching and applying tension. At the same time, be sure that you are in control of the aspiration and that you can react quickly, because as soon as it is cut, the aspiration, if it's too strong, you have the risk of losing the piece, or you know, that it goes all the way up into the biopsy pipette. So yes, what's important here is that if you do have to apply another shot because the junctions are too strong, then choose a different position. Avoid you know, applying pulses repeatedly on the same position, because it will lead to hardening of the proteins, and it's you know, creating damage, and also it will become sticky, and you should try to avoid that. So then you have your biopsy, usually around 4 cells. It depends on the lab that you're working with. Should be enough. You would next proceed to tube the cells, tube the biopsy to send them to the lab for analysis, and vitrify the blastocyst. What happens then when we have an embryo like this? Maybe it is halfway out of the zona pellucida, maybe it is even completely hatched. In cases like this, you cannot do a pulling like the one I explained before, because, like I said, we need a lot of tension, and as soon as you start to apply that tension, you will either completely finish removing the hatching the blast by that tension, by the aspiration, and simply you will not be able to hold it by the zona when you start to aspirate. And again, for the pulling, you do need a lot of stretching. So for a case like this, more challenging case, a very hatched embryo, or maybe even completely hatched, then here you can apply the so-called flicking technique. So let's have a look at that. For applying the flicking technique, you start very similar than you did with the pulling. You start to aspirate the trophectoderm, position it strategically, you start to aspirate. The difference here is that this is a combination of the laser effect and the mechanical effect of the flick. When we're doing the pulling, we're aiming for cutting the junctions between the cells, but in this case, we are aiming for weakening the junctions between the cells. So because we cannot stretch them so much, we simply choose some positions. We aspirate, grab some cells into the pipette, then apply the pulses, and then we will position the pipettes one on top of each other and do the mechanical flick. I'm going to show you another slide first, and then we'll see it in a video. So let's start by the image on the lower left side. Here you see that a portion of the trophectoderm is already into the pipette, inside the pipette. And at this point, we have already done some laser pulses, roughly right outside of the edge of the biopsy pipette. We choose strategically between cells so that these pulses remain right outside at the edge of the biopsy pipette, so that when we do the flick, it is a clean cut. When we're positioning the pipettes, we position them in a way that the biopsy pipette will be on top of the holding at the highest level, because of course the holding pipette has a much bigger diameter, like you see here, the highest level. And once we do that, we will go upwards with the holding pipette. First, only moving the holding pipette, and you will end up with a tension on the biopsy side, and that's perfectly fine. The pipette will not break, it is flexible, so no need to worry about that. And then you move the biopsy pipette all the way down in a steady movement, and that will give you a piece that will remain at the tip. If you do this systematically, step by step, it will work every single time. So then you One thing that's important is before you do the flick that you control the aspiration on the biopsy side so that when the cut happens, the piece remains here at the tip. Good, so let's have a look at the biopsy examples. First video is a pulling, so let's have a look. We have positioned the embryo properly. This is ideal case that you have the inner cell mass here at around 12. So when you're applying the suction here, you're not going to, you don't have the risk of like damaging the inner cell mass or applying too much pressure. And you have a small herniating portion of the trophectoderm, which will be good to take enough cells. And we want to take maybe probably about half of that hatching part. So we focus very well, we come closer with the biopsy pipette, sit next to the cell that we want to start to aspirate. As to the aspiration, now we have the junctions exposed. We apply one laser pulse with the target pointer. You can see it, 2 pulses already. And that's the 3rd laser pulse. There you go. So there's our biopsy ready to be tubed. Now let's have a look at an example for a flicking. Here we started in the same way. We have it positioned here. It is hatching by the inner cell mass, but that's okay because we are having enough cells out here of the trophectoderm and we only want to cut a portion. In this case, we don't have the target pointer, so you cannot see exactly where the pulses are happening, but you do see the reaction on the embryo. There was one pulse right there. And every time it collapses with each pulse, we take advantage of that collapsing to gently come closer with the biopsy pipette so that we can have enough cells inside. Now we release it from the holding side and we're going to do the positioning of the pipette. So if you could identify where the pulses happen, we have roughly done some weakening of the junctions around this, let's say, imaginary line right outside of the edge of the biopsy pipette. With less magnification, you can better visualize how we do it. So now we are aligning the edge of the biopsy pipette with this portion of the holding pipette where you have this curvature. And we make sure that we are really at the top of the holding pipette. We move upwards in one direction, create the tension, and then bring the biopsy pipette downwards. And you see that it was a very clean cut, very straightforward, and that the piece remained at the tip because we had controlled the aspiration before doing the flick. So there you go. Now you have a look and you check the biopsy. You see that you have enough cells, and then you also go and have a look at the embryo. And then you would proceed with the tubing and the vitrification. Okay, great. So now to wrap it up, I want you to know that we have a lot of information available. So in case you need more information, please do contact your local representatives and let us know what you need. We have, for example, the tech notes, some tech notes for the application of the biopsy, for sperm viability testing, and also for blastocyst collapsing. We do have also workshops available, or can even organize them upon request. So simply let us know and ask if you're interested. And as I mentioned before, we also have a literature list in case you want to have a closer look at the publications and references. We also have an article published in our blog. So if you go to our website at vitrolife.com and click on blog and browse a little bit, you will find this laser article that we have published before. There you have more explanations about and some videos also about the applications for lasers. And please also go ahead and visit our social media or say hi in our social media. We're on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and this, for example, this is a view of our Facebook site, and we have several videos there. For example, here's one from a live embryo biopsy demonstrations that we have done at conferences. We have several of these videos from ESHRE and ASRM and other topics that might be interesting to you. So make sure you have a look at this information. And if you do have any more questions, we're happy to hear from you. So contact your representative or let us know. Here's also my email address and the email address of our office in Brooklyn, in Germany. So thank you very much for listening. I hope this was helpful to you and that you could learn some new insights that can be useful in your daily practice. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.